I don't usually wear my pink shirt, but I'm doing it tonight because I'm talking about flowers. I'm talking about the lotus in particular. It's time for flowers. It's springtime, of course, so you're seeing flowers everywhere. And in the Christian tradition, today is the traditional day of the Ascension, which represents flowering, completion of being, an entry into a rich and beautiful state of being. And all these things are symbolized often by flowers. What's especially interesting about flowers that are used in floral arrangements, and the lotus, say, in particular, is that you're not expecting a fruit. Most flowers, and many times you think of flower, well, that's just it's there for the sake of the fruit. But in the spiritual tradition, the flower is its own sake. It's a symbol of the fullness of reality. A full blossoming, a full blooming of reality, and we're not looking for a further fruit from that. You can talk about the fruits if you like, fruits of the spirit, etc. But there's a beauty to, the flower itself that's used in the spiritual traditions. So in Buddhism, of course, it is the lotus, but it's also used in related traditions. What I really want to point out, and this might seem a little abstruse, is it's used in the chakras, the chakra system, the energy system, representing our being and the different levels and energies of our being. And as chakra, as means wheel, because it's turning, it's not stationary. And this is things my own yoga teacher taught quite explicitly and beautifully. And in fact, we're whirring back and forth in different directions. It's almost like the wheels in the vision of Ezekiel, So if it's whirring to the right, or my right anyway, it means that it's going out into form. But if it's whirring to the left, it means it's moving back towards the absolute. So there's this continually back and forth of being itself, our own being itself, between the relative and the absolute, emptiness and form, which are always there and always interpenetrating. Always emptiness is form and form is emptiness. And the relative in the absolute, etc. And this is true in all, these are realities in all the traditions. But it's interesting that that's there in the very dynamic of the chakra. Now, the reason I mention this specifically is that when it's theoretically stationary, it's a lotus. It has petals. And you find many testify to this, and my own teacher was clairvoyant, and he could see this. So it's not even just an image, it's actually real. I mean, that there are, if you want to call that, metaphorically petals, but that there are these elements that resemble petals. And it's interesting, if you go down the chakras, you have the numbers of petals lessens. So if you have if you've got 1,000 petal lotus on the crown chakra, but then you go all the way down, the throat has 16, the heart has 12, the solar plexus has 10, the navel chakra, the hara in Zen has 8, the sex chakra has 6, and the good old solid base chakra has 4, the four directions. But the dynamic is especially beautiful if you see what my teacher said about it. In the crown chakra, you have 12 inner petals and 960 outer petals, 8 times 120. And the thing is, as the energy grows, as the being becomes more complete, as it becomes richer and more expressive, it actually blooms. It can be just like a point to start with, this energy center, but then as it grows, it actually blooms, and expands like a flower, like the lotus. It's really beautiful. So, for example, you may be familiar with the famous mantra Om Mani Padme Om Hom, which means blessed be the jewel in the lotus. The jewel is the blue pearl of consciousness in the center of your head, the pineal gland. But the lotus is the crown chakra blooming. That's the lotus that they're talking about there. And the correspondences are really good. They speak about my master taught about the twin hearts meditation, the divine heart and the human heart coming together, the 12 petals here correspond to the 12 inner petals up here, or say the divine energy coming down in the hara, coming down to the hara in the Zen tradition, the 8. So you have the 960, 8 times 12 and the 8 times here. So there's fascinating correspondences between the levels which show the interrelationship and interpenetration, interaction of the different levels. And all of it is, the blossoming of being, the blossoming of the energy at various levels. And ultimately, you're just one big lotus. The whole universe is one big lotus, which, of course, whatever you enter in form, you have the whole universe there at once. If you're familiar at all with the Tibetan tradition, it's very interesting. You have white Tara and green Tara, and also Chenrezig, who's the Bodhisattva of compassion in the Tibetan tradition. All three of them in their traditional iconography are holding flowers. Big blue flowers. I guess they don't have lotuses in Tibet. Maybe it's too cold. But they have this Utpala flower, it's called. If you ever check it out online, you can find these big blue flowers that they're holding. And it's interesting, there's the female figures and the compassionate figures that are holding this flower of the blossoming of being. The blossoming of being is compassion. And of course, the most striking of all, I think, is the fact that wherever you find the Dhyana Buddhas or the Bodhisattvas or the Buddhas, the Buddha himself sitting there in a mandala or a painting, what are they sitting on? Lotus, yeah. It's always a lotus that they're sitting on, which means they're blossoming up from being itself, if you like, and they are the expression of being itself. They are the lotus, so it represents just this blossoming and flourishing of awareness and being and consciousness and all, which is really, really very beautiful. And of course, also the mythology, or rather the stories that often go with the lotus. With the fact that it comes up from the mud, in a pond, and goes through the water, and then finally blossoms out into the air. So you start with all the mud and the passion and all that stuff with your, bodily passions, etc., coming up through the water of your heart and emotions, and then up to the full consciousness, into the air, and it's where the blossoming, the crown, etc. You may know this particular icon. It's by Brother Michael Reyes, has been taught here, the Franciscan brother, disciple of Robert Lentz. This is Sophia. It's the Christ figure above a lotus. And, the discussion on the back is Sophia is the fullness of being, Christ himself of the lotus, but it's through the Paschal mystery. It's the same idea. You're coming through the suffering and through the mess, through into resurrection or ascension, as we're just celebrating today. So there's a whole process here, and all of it is necessary. All of it is included. All of it is integrated into it. There's no part that's a mistake or that's not included. And in the end, the relative and the absolute come together, which is what the ascension is and what enlightenment is, and the Buddha, and it's really quite glorious. I'll illustrate this with and of course there's people lead this around in my gym occasionally. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, which is the Buddha's Pure Land. Blessed be or praise to the great Lotus Sutra. Lotus Sutra, again, a symbol of the fullness of being. But in terms of koans, there are a number of koans that speak about flowers and lotus. I'm going to just look briefly at a couple of them to illustrate the point I'm making about it representing the fullness of reality, absolute and relative together. The most famous koan of all about a flower, I dare say, is the sixth one in the Mumonkan, which is the Buddha himself, Siddhartha, Shakyamuni passing on his Dharma transmission to his disciple Mahakasyapa. And very famously, he's giving his final sermon and doesn't say anything. He just holds up a flower. Okay. And the flower, of course, is the whole of reality. Everything is there. So if you really see the flower, you are the flower, and it's everything. So Mahakasyapa smiles. He's the only one that does that. And so the Buddha says, he gets it. So he gets it. He gets the transmission. And then he adds, I have the true Dharma eye, the marvelous mind of nirvana, the true form of the formless, and the subtle Dharma gate. Well, obviously it does include everything. if all of that is mentioned there. Case 24 is Fuketsu's speech and silence. A monk asks Fuketsu, both speech and silence are faulty in being, one or the other, the duality. How can we escape this? And Fuketsu replies, I always remember the spring in Konan, where the partridges sing, how fragrant the countless flowers. So in other words, as soon as you get duality, which is, of course, the Ajna chakra with its two petals, actually 48 and 48, but two sides. This goes beyond the duality of speech and silence or absolute and relative or anything else. And how do you get beyond that? Well, just breathe in the springtime and look at the partridges and the countless flowers and their fragrance. And you got it. If you really got it, if you're really there. So it is not just represents all of reality, but it is all of reality. Case 40 in the Blue Cliff record, Nansen, who is the master of Jokshu and who was always talking, pointing toward the absolute, Nansen's this flower. So this guy's talking with Nansen and he says, this master said, heaven and earth and I are of the same root. All things and I are of one substance. Isn't that absolutely fantastic? Well, yes it is, but it sounds a little heady, So Nansen just points to a flower in the garden and says, people these days see this flower as though they were in a dream. So go beyond what nice things you read in a book. Just go to the flower and don't just see it as if you're in a dream, which is the way most people do. Oh, isn't that a pretty flower? Yeah, but it's the universe, and so are you. It's it. You want to wake up from your dream. See the flower. Looking it up. And finally, this is a column that nobody ever quotes, so you're privileged today. Number 21 in the Blue Cliff record. Chimon's lotus flower and lotus leaves. Lotus flower and lotus leaves. So a monk asks Chimon, what will the lotus flower be when it has not yet come up out of the water? So it's part of that process still, yeah? And Chimon said, the lotus flower. So everything is already there no matter what point it's at in the eternal now, when it's right there. It's all there. In the bud, it's already there. So the lotus flower is already there. Everything is there at any point. See, it's a little trickier. That's why nobody quotes it. So then they ask, well, what about it when it is out of the water? When it's bloomed and everything. And he says, well, then it's just the lotus leaves. In other words, when it seems to be the relative, it's already the absolute. And when it seems to be the absolute, it's still the relative. And it's all there together. Everything is included. And everything is simultaneous. You can sit with that for a while. But what is the corresponding flower? We don't have the lotus at all in Western culture. What is the corresponding flower in the Western spirituality and culture? No. Yes, the rose. So you have the mystical rose. You have Rosicrucians. You have the rosary. You have the rose windows in cathedrals. Dante's final vision is of the rose, the heavenly rose. Heaven is a rose. All reality is a lotus. Exactly the same thing, just with a different image. And even the rose window in a cathedral, really very beautiful because it has all different characters in each of the petals, and they're all interrelated, and they're all branching out from each other. That's the beauty of a rose. You have like a spiral. And so everything is included. It's the final reality. It's just a flower. what a wonderful correspondence with the Eastern insights. And even more so, if it represents all those individual figures, the relative, in other words, when the sun comes through, the light, that's the absolute, illuminating everything. So, as I have done before, I think I'm going to close by quoting the very end of the Four Quartets of T.S. Eliot, which fits this perfectly. First of all, he speaks about not ceasing from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So you're going from the pretty flower to the whole universe. Wow! Okay. A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And how long do you have to sit or live before you realize it costs everything? But it's complete simplicity. And then a quote from Julian of Norwich, the English mystic, "And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." And if you don't perceive that yet, we're not at the end yet. And then finally, this is where it fits with what I'm saying today. When the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, the Holy Spirit coming down on Pentecost, and the fire and the rose are one. The fire and the rose are one. The absolute and the relative are one. The divine God and the universe are one. Now, nothing more to be said after that, is there?